Welcome back. You're watching Global Today here on Morning Prime, where we take a critical analysis on matters, international affairs, diplomacy, geopolitics, and foreign policy. We are turning our focus now on Ethiopia, where the UN Chief, Antonio Guterres, has warned that the situation in Ethiopia was spiraling out of control as fighting raged in the north of the country, and the government vowed to seize control of airports and other sites in Tigray. International alarm has been mounting over the upsurge in combat in Tigray, where Ethiopian forces and troops from neighboring Eritrea have stepped up an offensive near the city of Shire. The EU and the US also issued urgent appeals for a halt to the fighting, following on the heels of a call from African Union for an immediate and unconditional truce. Now, since the war began almost 2 years ago between federal forces and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, that is TPLF, untold numbers of civilians have been killed. 2 million people have been driven from their homes, and millions more are in need of aid. Let's just listen into what he had to say.
The situation in Ethiopia is spiraling out of control. Violence and destruction have reached alarming levels. The social fabric is being ripped apart. Hostilities in the Tigray region of Ethiopia must end now, including the immediate withdrawal and disengagement of Eritrean armed forces from Ethiopia. There is no military solution. Civilians are paying a horrific price. Indiscriminate attacks, including in residential areas, are killing more innocent people every day, damaging critical infrastructure, and limiting access to vital services. Hundreds of thousands of people have been forced to flee their homes since hostilities resumed in August, many of them for the second time. And we are also hearing disturbing accounts of sexual violence and other acts of brutality against women, children, and men. All parties must adhere to their obligations under international humanitarian law. Civilians must be protected, and so too humanitarian workers who are being attacked and even killed delivering life-saving humanitarian aid. The level of need is staggering. Even before the resumption of hostilities, 13 million people required food and other support across Tigray, Amhara, and Afar. Deliveries of aid into Tigray have been suspended for more than 7 weeks, and assistance to Amhara and Afar has also been disrupted. All parties must allow and facilitate the rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for all civilians in need. The United Nations is ready to support the African Union in every possible way to end this nightmare for the Ethiopian people.
It's concerned, and questions have been raised about the involvement of Eritrea here. They were saying that, of course, now there is at least light at the end of the tunnel. They're almost getting the victory, but we have that word from the UN Secretary General himself that military action there on the ground is not really the solution. There was a very interesting editorial cartoon that was drawn there by Gado, as you can see it there. And this is all about the action of Ethiopians there and Eritrea on the negotiating table as it stands right now. Sorry, I'm late. Let's just begin with the statement that we've heard from the UN Secretary General. Your reaction, Dr. Hassan Kanenje?
It's true, Deval, that the situation is dire. I think about 3/4 of the population in Tigray needs some kind of food aid and other humanitarian assistance. You know, this is massive. Now, unfortunately, one thing that has been happening, much over the last almost 2 years now, is we're having lots of beautiful statements coming from the United Nations, but without really certain movements towards credible actions that can move the parties closer to a ceasefire, to a negotiating table. Now, the recent efforts by the AU, of course, faltered, and in part because of what was communicated, not just by President Uhuru Kenyatta, but by others. Number one, lack of structure, lack of definition in terms of rules of engagement, just a general state of unpreparedness. Now, if the international community is serious, the United Nations is serious, then they need to support a robust framework with certain timelines of engagement in terms where parties are concerned, but also ensure that they develop a framework that involves carrots and sticks to ensure that whatever is agreed, whether it's a ceasefire, whoever is going to violate it, for instance, they're going to hold him or her to account. And so just offering beautiful statements, and which is great because morally that is what you're supposed to be doing. But that is what we're supposed to be doing. We don't have the power to do anything else. The truth is the international system has the power to do something about it. And they have the ability to be able to at least act as honest mediators. Part of the challenge has also been the perception that they've not been very honest in the conflict. And that has also limited the type of engagement or the type of influence they have on the process. However, we don't have any other better system outside the current multilateral framework to be able to bring some kind of solution and sense to the Ethiopian conflict.
Well, the involvement of Eritrea here, because we have an article here by Alex Diwal, who says that tens of thousands of young Ethiopians who answered the call to serve in the national army are fighting for Eritrea. As Eritrean long-range artillery pounds Tigrayan positions, Ethiopian soldiers are sent into battle on the order of Isaias Afwerki. The Eritreans control every aspect of the operation. They have special squads behind the front lines to shoot troops who won't obey orders. And this is how low the Ethiopian government has stooped. It is sending its own troops to serve a foreign country to fight Ethiopians. Many will die. If they occupy any part of Tigray, these troops will be ordered to rape, torture, and kill civilians. It's exactly what we've had the UN Secretary General saying. So, is the Eritrean involvement here also complicating the whole scenario?
Alex Diwal is a very respected scholar and a very hands-on kind of a researcher in matters conflict, particularly in the Horn and the Sahel region, that area. So when I read him, I know there's something going wrong because that he gets it right. The question of Ethiopia, I listened to the statement by the Secretary General. I think we must congratulate him for turning the spotlight from Ukraine to Ethiopia, because for long we have been saying that there's too much focus on Ukraine at the expense of what is happening in our neighboring country of Ethiopia, and therefore the Secretary General Antonio Guterres has done us a great deal in this regard. But the way he's putting it, this is not an unrest. Let's face it. It started in November 2020 as a law enforcement mission, basically to bring law and order in Tigray. That's how it was explained by the Orthodoxy in Addis Ababa. And within a very short time, it has unleavened into a major war that was touching every corner of Ethiopia. At one point, there was even fear that the troops from Tigray would take over Addis Ababa again. And therefore, we need to call it what it is. It is the second Ethiopian civil war. We know the first civil war from the 70s all the way up to 1991. That's the first civil war. The second civil war is from the 4th of November 2020 to date. And until you call it what it is, then you can't solve it. You must name it the way it is. It is true what the Secretary General has said, that this conflict has an unparalleled humanitarian consequences. They are dire, perhaps dire than we have in Ukraine today. The number of Ethiopians dying. The other thing is what you have mentioned, Dibal, the international nature of this conflict.
Yes.
Previously, Somalia was involved because of the sympathies that the former Prime Minister former President of Somalia, Farmajo had with Eritrea and Ethiopia, that the so-called the Horn of Africa Cooperation. Now, the Horn of Africa Cooperation is teetering because now, the current President Hassan Sheikh is dealing with his own problems of Al-Shabaab. He's not concerned with what is happening in Ethiopia in that regard. And therefore, the involvement of Eritrea, and by the way, what you've heard from Alex Duval is correct, because I think it's one of our colleagues Matt Bryden described Eritrea as the most strategic country in the Horn. And I followed up with an analysis of the same, and my finding is the same, that Kenya is nowhere near Eritrea. Uganda is nowhere near Eritrea in terms of strategic thinking about war. Remember, Afwerki is the only remaining person within the Horn who came from but who shot his way into office. He fought his way into office and has stayed that long. There's nothing wrong with that. Liberation movements are always there and so on. But the issue is exporting this insurgency into the neighboring country. And why are you exporting? You are carrying on the old, ethnic war that had started during the first Ethiopian civil war. And therefore, the AU finds itself in a corner because it is compromised. And people need to come out openly and say this.
It is compromised.
For the first time, the AU is not just a toothless bulldog, but is an accomplice in what is happening in Addis Ababa. Why? Because its headquarters is in Addis Ababa, and it was the first. Remember, IGAD has been crippled. IGAD has not made any substantive efforts to do what it has done in Sudan, what it has done in Somalia, and elsewhere. There is no parallel. The EU is even worse. In a number of cases, I think it has tended to take sides. And that's why people are insisting on it just giving the structural guidelines and exiting the field. Otherwise, it is as useless in this matter as one can ever imagine. And this is not the AU we know. This is not the AU founded on the protocol establishing Peace and Security Council of the African Union. It is not. It is an AU that is worse than the Organization of African Unity before it in terms of response to internal dynamics. So what needs to be done? First and foremost, people like Alex Duval and others need to be called very quickly to give the true picture of the problem in Ethiopia. Because people are just looking at the problem in Ethiopia like the problem in Sudan, the problem in Congo. This is unique. Ethiopia is one of the countries that have ever been colonized. And therefore it rose to the modern times with its monarchical culture. And if you listen to or you read writings by Prime Minister Abiy, he says his mother dreamed that he would become the emperor. She did not dream that he was going to become the quintessential Democrat. Are you getting the mindset?
So we have back to Haile Selassie.
And before that, all the emperors, Mengistu
was the president or the prime minister?
Mengistu was the president, but the Marxist insurgent. Meles was the most enlightened of the dictators or the tyrants of the time because he was more developmental on his reign, but he still followed on that path. The Solomonic dynasty that Abiy is now trying to remove, he's replacing it with, quote unquote, an Oromo, the same. So the mindset is the same. It's not changing. What Ethiopia need is a referendum, or if you wish, a convention, to discuss the future of citizenship in that country in modern terms. And I said, if that is too expensive and it's difficult to do, then they also have a convention to think about how they are going back to the Solomonic dynasty and how they are going to democratize the space below. The space at the top is still very dictatorial. I don't think it's the choice of Abiy to be what it is. He would want Ethiopia to be democratic. That's how we saw him entering. But the underground, the environment in Ethiopia does not allow any individual to democratize the polity, because ethnic interests are so entrenched, they are so structuralized. If you read Mamdani, the Ugandan scholar,
Yes.
he says that when ethnicity becomes law, that is when it becomes dangerous. Here in this country, ethnicity is not law. It is basically a cultural phenomena. That's why we talk about each other, the Ruyas, the Ruya nation, the Murembe nation, the Kikuyu, the Gema nation, and all that, because it is not in law. But when it takes a legal dimension and you begin to fight interest in that way, it becomes very dangerous. It has to be dismantled. Ethiopia has to dismantle the monarchy and its ethnic relics.
Okay. They have been broaching the issue of secession. Maybe that will be a cure-all for the federal system of governance in Ethiopia. It will maybe cure also that particular ethnicity, the toing and froing between Oromos and the other clans as well. Oromos playing the upper hand for the longest time, but sheer numbers of course, the population that they do have in that country. Should we call for a cessation? Should we go for what really happened for South Sudan and Sudan? Still, we can see even in South Sudan, it is not really a matter of, yes, is secession also a subject that should be put on the table? I can see Kanenja really...
Several things that has to happen or is happening. One is there is no military solution. Whatever it is, whether Ethiopia is Ethiopia is one of the biggest military, establishment in Africa. But you cannot defeat Eritrea with that military. What we have at the end are carcasses of the Soviet-made weapon vintage that are sitting there, and a lot of people are dead. It will not happen, and everybody must understand that. Secondly, diplomacy is the answer. But we have a situation here that Professor Kagwanja is explaining. Africa has failed. Africa is failing to deal with its own internal affairs. EGAT, which really need to be a forefront of AU and arm of AU, is not making any headway. And therefore, it calls for international organization, UN, supported by America and Europe. The approach that America took earlier was wrong, which is imposing sanctions on Ethiopia without understanding all the complex situation that is happening. So there is need to understand who is supporting who, because there's a lot of infiltration of small arms into Eritrea, in all sides. There's a lot of arms that are coming in there, which manage this group to continue fighting. Is it coming from Russia, from Egypt, from where? That need to be exposed very clearly. Now, first thing first, internal dynamic of Ethiopia has to be addressed. Prime Minister became with a really goodwill, but the situation is overwhelming. They have to address the historical differences and inequalities within ethnic groups within Ethiopia. That has to be honestly addressed before you talk about diplomacy and everything. And lastly, external infiltration, wherever it's coming from, has to be exposed by the African. Africa has to say enough is enough. Burkina Faso is a very clear case where Russia is interfering, throwing the other regime, another regime come in to serve the interests of Russia. All that has to be stopped, and AU can help Africa help itself. That's the reason we appointed.
Well, you still didn't answer my question on the issue of secession that I asked you.
I don't know about succession.
All right, let's hear from Professor.
Thank you, Dibal. I don't think the answer is in secession.
Yeah.
Because there are various social and political dynamics that have not adequately been addressed. And therefore, this kind of perpetuates the senselessness of the war, which is increasingly becoming demoralizing, as it has been put. Let me mention some 3 or 4 things that are critical, because what characterizes the conflict now is the level of intractability of that conflict, whereby, if not addressed wholesome, then there are issues that will keep simmering up. So what we need is a new framework for resolving the crisis. And there's need to move away from preoccupation with conflict management and conflict resolution to embrace the intricacies and dynamics that conflict transformation entails. And so I think that calls for a serious shift in paradigm, and to have people with skills in conflict transformation to address the issues Professor is raising, the internal dynamics, including the historical injustices, that will require an approach that verges on conflict transformation. Secondly, I do support the idea of the weakness of AU, given that there is lack of powerful mechanisms of intervention, there is lack of adequate infrastructure of conflict transformation because of the weak institutional arrangements and lack of capacity, including skills, to make a lasting peace in that region. And that brings me to the third concern, looking at the internal dynamic, whereby I think the Ethiopians need to realize the need to address the subject of nation state, the project of the nation state, whereby the issues of citizenship, the issues of nationhood, the issues of the required statecraft to address this become very critical in helping the country achieve a sense of cohesiveness in the way it is approaching the question of conflict. So, what does that point to? Point number 4 is the necessity of rethinking of the Ethiopian state. And I like the invocation of Mahmoud Mamdani's notion of when ethnicity is politicized, it says that brings about tribalism, which Koigo Amweri will call negative ethnicity, because ethnicity in itself is innocent as a marker of identity. It is the dastardly manipulation of ethnicity that turns it around into a very dangerous thing. So what do we need to do with ethnic identities in the creation of a new national culture, which seems to be the problem Ethiopians need to engage as part of the creation of a new sense of the nation state project. That is where the problem is, and it's not just restricted to Ethiopia. It is widely an African problem. So AU therefore must think in terms of the required political philosophy and approach in reconstruction of the state, reinvention of the state in Africa. That's why I'm talking about rethinking of the state.
Right. Dr. Hassan Kanenja.
About secession, right? Dibal, there is a crisis of the nation state on the continent. Somalia is a nation, has been trying to become a state. Ethiopia is a state that is now trying to become a nation. And why do I say that? A nation is composed of a group of people with the same culture, history, and aspirations, and language, like Somalia. But a state is different. It requires to have a territory people and its sovereign in transacting business internationally. And much of Africa have been states trying to become nations so they can actually be nation states, because they were composed of many different nations that never had anything in common, but now they were trying to work to become a nation state as one entity. Some like Kenya has been going through it. In fact, part of some of the conflicts and the fallout is actually a manifestation of us trying to negotiate a sense of nationhood. What does it mean to be Kenyan? Now, for much of Ethiopia's history, it has not had a chance to negotiate that. Now, this is the first time it's also coming out to terms with the idea of creating a nation state. Now, the Oromo, while the majority, as mentioned, they've not exactly been the aristocracy. The aristocracy has been owned by the North. Okay, and part of the problem today is because of the threat to the status quo that has always existed, to try to change things from the way they always used to be, because the two communities, especially the Tigray and the Amhara, of course, have dominated Ethiopian body politics for much of the last 200 years, and for much of the last 30 years, it was largely a Tigray aristocracy, which, of course, the status quo was appended with the election of Abiy Ahmed and the subsequent forming of the Prosperity Party, which then challenged this notion of these disparate groups of nations that are trying to stake a claim to Ethiopia. Now, while some have proposed balkanization of Ethiopia, or let's say allowing now the Tigray region to go, remember right now there are about 9 states already. Okay, now what will happen to Sidama? What will happen to Afar? What will happen to Amhara? And the Oromia, who are as numerous as the entire population of Kenya, what if they decide they no longer want to be part of a patchwork of small other nations? That is going to be a challenge. But also going to go contrary to a lot of resolutions and kind of general consensus within the continent that this border should not exactly be changed because it may set a bad precedents. Now, you mentioned South Sudan, but South Sudan has a fairly different history. And the reason is that union was largely imposed, was kind of an Anglo-Egyptian imposition. Okay, there was really nothing similar in terms of aspirations or anything like that. And the situation wasn't helped. Now, that doesn't mean that it could not have worked, but the situation wasn't helped by the kind of very exclusive theocratic nature of the government in Khartoum at the time, that literally then excluded the people, of course, of the South. And subsequently, then religion was used to whip up emotions and to mobilize people along religious lines, which, of course, some of us always used to see it from political perspectives. Some people around the world looked at it from religious perspectives. And I think we were proved when the conflict in Darfur broke out, because then those were Muslims too. You understand? And so we cannot exactly replicate that. Not to mention, there was a period of where South Sudan was to decide whether this marriage, was worth it. And so mutually they agreed that this marriage had to end. So that situation we can't replicate in Ethiopia. So balkanizing Ethiopia at this stage may be appealing, may be one of perhaps the solutions, but I don't think it's going to be a viable solution. It may lead to work with lots of wars. We have seen, and some of us were talking about this immediately after the CPA, that after the South Sudan gets independent, there were certain contradictions that had not been sorted out, in terms of what I said, elite pacting, ethnic sharing of power. But then ended up creating certain, like, 2 centers of power that literally set each other against each other at some point. We knew that was going to happen, because while there was unity of purpose in terms of resisting Khartoum, there was really no unity of purpose with regard to building a nation state in South Sudan at the time. And so these people held very different visions of where they wanted South Sudan to look like. And that is partly contributed to the kind of nightmare, of course, we saw with the outbreak of the second war in South Sudan. And so it is not, I think, in place of the regional organizations right now, or even the African Union, to try and push that position, because not only is that going to increase more demands, because then each state will be forced to form its own militia. Remember, right now, almost each region has some kind of militia already. Okay, now they're going to start contesting for everything. It We need also to understand, Ethiopia is the largest country by population in this region, the second most populous on the continent.
After Nigeria?
Yeah. Yes, after Nigeria. The third is Egypt and then Congo, number 4. But still resources are extremely limited. You see, just to give an example, their budget this past year was $16 billion. Our budget was $36 billion. So balkanizing these small, some of those regions are as small as 144,000 square kilometers. 144 square kilometers, actually, very, very small. Balkanize them is not going to make them any more viable, It's actually going to make certain things worse. It's going to increase competition over what belongs to where. And because of this kind of trans-border nature of the resources within the state, is going to increase competition over resources, which is going to fuel more conflict. And so one thing that is going to need to be done, and I keep going back to the 1995 constitution, that I say kind of planted the seeds of Ethiopia's potential disintegration. Yeah. On one hand, it gave states the right to self-determination. If they choose, they're no longer interested in the marriage. You understand? But then at the same time, you're trying to build a unitary state. How those things work. And that is why the Prosperity Party, for instance, went against the philosophy of the 1995 constitution of allowing this kind of independence. But then it's the same thing was cited by the TPLF in saying, well, actually the constitution provides us with this. We are no longer happy with it. So we need to go back and negotiate the constitution of Ethiopia, have a different dispensation that is going to reflect the realities of where it is, where it's coming from, and where it needs to go. If we don't go back to those fundamentals, it's going to be very challenging. Prof, I mentioned to you, my PhD thesis was actually constitution making as conflict management. And did across nationals of about 30 countries. And how that thing is created is very fundamental in determining the stability of the future of Ethiopia.
Right. So
on the question of secession,
yes, please.
I thought we needed to historicize this to see where the whole idea of Tigray seeking or assumed to be seeking a solution in secessionism is coming in. That's very important. First, we started by saying that Ethiopia is made of 3 classes. We talk about ethnic group, but basically there are 3 blocks. You can call them 2 first. The first are the Solomonic groups, those that track or trace their origin from Solomon. The Amhara are said to be the direct, children of the Queen of Sheba and Solomon. But then the Tigrayans are supposed to be the helper of Sheba. That was very common in the Middle East. If you remember, the 12 tribes of Israel don't come from the married people. The 2, they come from that amalgamation. That was very common. But that's not important. The most important thing here is the ideology that emerges from this. And the ideology is that the Tigrayans, from the beginning, became the fighters, the soldier class. And remember, societies that time, whether you're going to Rwanda or you're talking about Burundi, the division was very clear that the Tigrayans are the soldiers, the Amhara are the bureaucrats, and the Oromo and the rest are the providers of what is needed, right? In terms of farming, supporting the state in agriculture. Therefore, just like the Hutus in Rwanda and Burundi, the Oromos were more because they are the producers. And so on. The Tigrayans were fewer because they are the soldiers, they are ultimate. And then the monarchy would be based on the Amhara. Now, what happened is that with overthrow of Haile Selassie disrupted that order. And when Mengistu came to power and trained his guns as a soldier on the Tigrayans, they joined with the Eritreans. And the Eritreans had been waging war against the monarchy from 1950s, I think 56. So the Tigrayans joined the Eritreans. And it is that union of the 2 that swept into Addis Ababa in 1991. And within it, they had co-opted members of the Oromo into their war. And they had also co-opted some of the Somalis. The Ogaden Liberation Front were part of that force. Abiy himself is a product of that union between Eritrea and Tigray. And it is said that Meles and Afewoki are cousins. This is a myth, or might be reality, but for the best of us, it's a myth that they are cousins. When they came to Addis Ababa, they decided that they are going to quarter Ethiopia. Meles remains in Addis Ababa, and Afewoki takes its independence. In 1993, Addis Ababa, Eritrea, ceases to be. And for the first time, Ethiopia loses a coastline. It has a naval power. It doesn't have a naval power anymore because it has no coastline. It could export its own goods. Now it has to pass through Djibouti and to explore alternative ports in Kenya and Somalia because of that landlockedness. Ethiopia would now be the largest country on the continent in terms of size. But what the importance of this is that when Abiy came to power, he went back to the liberation issue. He had the difference is with the Meles. If you look at the voting pattern, the voting that swept Abiy to power, the Amhara allied with the others, the Oromo and others, and they voted Abiy in. The Tigrayans voted to a man against Abiy. So already the seeds of this division was sown as soon as Abiy got into power. And therefore, when Abiy flew to Asmara for what was seen as ending the Cold War, the fight with Eritrea, it was actually a military pact. And the Norwegians and the others made a mistake by interpreting this one as a peace process, and they forgot. They lost the logic of that detente between Addis Ababa and Eritrea. It was now a new pact, and this is the pact that is fighting in the north. So when Abiy disagreed now with the Tigrayans, particularly because of his reforms, the quick reforms that he basically dislodged the Tigrayans, and Tigrayans were the major military power in the north. The northern command of Ethiopia was literally the Ethiopian military, so to say, the northern command in Mekere. So what is the point? The point is that Tigray will now secede because Eritrea seceded. It is not the same argument you can make about the Oromo.
The Oromos, yes.
No, you can't make the same argument. The same thing is the Ogaden Liberation Front has always wanted to secede and join Somalia. Yes. That was the idea about the 1978, 77, 78 Ogaden War, because those had wanted to go. So there is a secession question there, but the Tigray question is the more likely one. Why? Because they have already, some of their thinkers have already started thinking about a confederacy with Eritrea outside Ethiopia, because they are not also happy about the landlocked nature of Ethiopia. Yes, they are not. So what we see here is is not a kind of a federation. It is what they call a confederacy. Confederacy, a free, independent, and autonomous Tigray joining with Eritrea to form whatever they are going to call that confederacy.
That is within Ethiopia?
No, outside Ethiopia.
That is outside Ethiopia.
But which is ethnically homogeneous, because the Tigrayans and the Eritreans are one tribe.
All right, so even looking at this particular picture, as you just mentioned, that we have also naively the Western diplomat who seem to believe that Abiy's assurance that Eritrea will withdraw, or that it was just a benign presence. The Tigrayans never bought that line. They knew that even if Abiy was sincere in wanting peace, his personal intention was absolutely irrelevant, while Isaiah still had his claws deep inside Ethiopia, just given the history that you're giving us as well. And Isaiah is single-minded in pursuit of his goal, and he will override Abiy's tactical maneuvers if they ever seriously transgress his interests. Were the diplomats duped, just listening to what is really happening currently, that yes, let's drop them in, but it seems Isaiah Afwerki is in. and he's not really coming out.
That's what we are saying. That's essentially what we are saying, that it is not Afewoki who submitted to Abiy. It's Abiy who submitted to Afewoki. So the April 2018 transfer of power.
So he submitted believing that...
No, he wasn't believing in anything. He was at a siege at home because the Tigrayans occupied every corner of the armed forces. They have the Northern Command, they are the intelligence, the army commander was Tigrayan, the intelligence commander, the courts of law, everything was Tigrayan, who are only 6% of the population. And therefore, for him to be secure after the election,
thank you,
and he had to go to Eritrea for protection, if you wish.
For protection. All right, Nomi Damba.
Well, I think that Professor Kagwanja gave us a fairly good historical grasp of the depth of the issues within the internal Ethiopia itself. And unless that is addressed, everything else will be glossy over the dynamite. It can't work. It's a complex situation. And AU is not helping at this point. And that's the reason why I say Ethiopia is a huge country in Africa and has the potential to feed a lot of people when it's stable. It was growing very fast before this war breakdown. When it breaks down, it will impact the entire continent of Africa. And therefore, we need help, realistic, looking at the dynamic within Ethiopia itself, and also the external interference. We need a UN structure to come in and join together with OAU and help Prime Minister Abiy. This is going to be his legacy. If he can address it and then exit, then it bring a nation state together. It doesn't matter what kind of form it takes, but every parts of Ethiopia, all the major ethnic groups has to participate. Okay. So there has to be a clear governance leading to a resolution.
All right. So even if as we bring this to a close, so that we can gravitate to other matters as well, I like what Alex Dival is saying. That Isaiah has also suffered a setback. And we want just to address the issue of Isaiah himself, because he seems to be the destabilizing factor around the Horn of Africa. When you look at Sudan, when you look at Somalia, when you look now currently at Ethiopia, shouldn't he be called out for what he is right now? He's a destabilizing dictator, so to speak. And this is what Alex Dival is saying. He's saying Isaiah's also suffered a setback earlier this year when Somalis rebuffed Mohamed Farmajo as his choice of president for the Somali federal government, as I had been schooling Farmajo as a dictator and training his special forces. Isaiah has also faced setbacks in his efforts to destabilize Sudan, but he continues to have his way in Ethiopia. Only the Tigray Defense Forces stand in the way of Isaiah's ambition. Every other African and international leader has been willfully blind to the fact that should have been evident for so long. If Isaiah prevails in this war, the Tigrayans will face genocide. He will be the master of Ethiopia, is pulling the strings of a collapsed state, and the African leadership and international community will not be able to say they once warned. Professor Seka.
I think a meaningful discussion of this will be brought by people who are entrenched in the history and politics of that region, like my brother Dr. Hanenje and Professor Kagwanja. But my comment is three-pronged. Number one, the danger of fragmentation, which really discounts the issue of secession. Yeah, because there's the dynamic of fragmentation embedded in the course of secession. And you remember part of the quest, which was idealistic on the part of the state of Oromia, was the empowerment of the Oromo. But when you look at the Oromo themselves, and to take the Kenyan example, between the Gabra and of course the Borana and the Orma, you can see serious conflicts of a sub-ethnic nature. So that really secession does not erase the prospect of very serious forms of conflict and confrontation due to sub-ethnic nationalisms. So that will not be solving the problem. It will just be bringing it to another level. The second critical issue that one will talk about is the need for the leadership to recognize the importance of ideology as a tool for social and political organization, so that in the creation of the state, then strategies can be devised by which then the challenge and setback of regional sub-ethnic consciousness can be engaged for purposes of transforming the state in a very positive sense. And I would say that what I said earlier about the rethinking of the state is very, very critical here. But that will not be able to work given the nature of embedded interests and positions taken by the protagonists, unless there is international intervention with a view to helping the Ethiopians create a sense of cohesion in the way they look at the state and prospects of the developing of the state. That's what I would say in a sense, because the sub-ethnic nationalisms which are subtarian have to be dealt with, because they reach a point at which they blow out and destabilize anything that has assumed to be developed at that particular point. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much. That is what is the current state of play in Ethiopia, and the warning there from United Nations Secretary General that it's spiraling out of control. Now, what does China want? What does China want? That is what is headlining the front page of The Economist, the latest copy right now. Right? This is what China wants. You can read all about it inside The Economist. We'll just pick up on that so that we can look at it together. And you know, on Sunday, we had the CCP party. That is, of course, the Communist Party holding their very pivotal event in the calendar of the China or the CCP party, as it were. And we know the Communist Party has been obsessed with control. But under President Xi Jinping, that obsession has deepened. This is what they're saying here in The Economist. After 3 decades of opening and reform under previous leaders, China has in many ways become more closed and autocratic under Mr. Xi. Surveillance has broadened, censorship has stiffened, partisans flex their muscles in private firms, preserving the party's grip on power trumps any other consideration. It continues to say no despotic regime in history has had resources to match modern China's, and unlike the leader of a democracy, Mr. Xi can't snap his fingers and deploy them. What does this really portend, especially for the world order as it is right now? We want to take a short break. When we come back, we look at Xi's ironclad grip on China. And now he has, of course, a third time over or up his collective sleeves on the leadership of China. What does it really portend for China? What happens also